Damaged Defenders by Sherza. Chapter 132. Steve! Despite the reason they'd be running around the world, Steve figured he was going to enjoy it. The war, including his attempts to sign up, aside, he'd rarely left Brooklyn, never mind New York City. Yeah, he'd seen a bunch of places in the States and Europe after that, but he hadn't exactly seen much, or in the case of Europe, seen it anywhere near its best. This time, well, yeah, they'd still be doing a tour of sorts, but it'd be a lot more extensive because the entire purpose of it was to help their alien allies familiarize themselves with the planet. Steve figured he'd get to see a lot of really interesting places and people before it was all over. They had all gotten up earlier than usual to head to the mansion. The X-Men being the team they'd probably work with the most, Steve wanted as much time with them as he could get. That had provided its own amusement, as fully half the gang had been the next best thing to zombies as they shuffled onto the jet. Seeing them like that, you'd never know those same people were fully capable of being wide awake, aware, and ready to fight at the same hour, and with the same amount of sleep, if there was an emergency. While they weren't bringing all the non-combatants from the tower, they were bringing a few. Betty, just in case. Hulk hadn't been a problem with the team yet, but adding a bunch of strangers into the mix might end up with him having a problem. Cecilia's inclusion was a no-brainer. May Parker had insisted on coming as well. Less to keep an eye on Peter and more to ensure the gang got fed to her standards, Steve thought. He'd met her type back in the day. She'd feed and mother everyone that got within range, whether they wanted or needed it or not. Darcy had been a last-second addition. She'd added herself with a rather pointed look Loki's way, after Frigga warned/reminded them that a group of Jotuns would be joining them in Canada and tagging along to Asia since most of them were going to be in those two places. Loki'd been looking like he'd sucked a lemon ever since. Darcy had apparently elected herself as Loki's not really involved in the melodrama support person at some point. Which Loki did need someone of that sort because inasmuch as Thor and Frigga clearly loved and wanted to support and help Loki, they'd been involved in the whole mess up to their eyeballs. Because of that, it was entirely possible for Loki to not want anything to do with them if he hit a bad patch. Steve didn't know how well or even if Darcy's self-appointment was working, but since she wasn't making it worse, he was more than willing to let her come with. Once at the mansion, Steve and Scott had spent the better part of an hour talking strategy and tactics, while the rest of the Avengers and X-Men had chatted, getting to know each other. Steve made due note that Logan, he really needed to remember to call him by the name he went by now, was still giving Jean death glares. He was going to have to keep an eye on that. Well, he hadn't gotten to know Logan extremely well back in the war. He'd gotten to know him well enough to know that Logan had an extremely low, non-existent tolerance for threats to folks under his protection. Anyone dumb enough to go there had paid a hefty price. Steve figured out the only reason Loki hadn't kicked Jean's butt 6 ways from Sunday is that they had both been at least nominally on the same team until the incident. Steve didn't know Logan anywhere near well enough to know how well or long Logan's temper would hold out with Jean no longer on his team, especially if she got it in her head to pull a similar stunt again. At any rate, most of the reason Steve wanted to talk tactics with Scott was because it hadn't really occurred to him until the whole mess was over that it was odd that Scott would hand over command of a team he led. Sure, there was the whole Captain America thing and Steve's experience in the war, but Steve hadn't known any of the X-Men or their abilities from a hole in the ground, and Scott did. The talk with Scott had cleared up Steve's confusion. He and Scott were actually pretty close when it came to their knowledge of strategy and tactics. The difference between them came in when it came to where and with whom they'd had the most experience exercising that knowledge. Scott's experience was with a very small team against single individuals, or at worst, the incident involving Rogue, 4 or 5 enemies. None of whom were well-trained combatants. Not even Magneto and his buddies, though they'd been closer to it than most. And with the exception of the incident with Rogue, every incident of combat had been a single bout, because there were no reinforcements of any kind for their opponent. Steve, on the other hand, had a larger group, though admittedly not hugely larger, at his command, and employed his strategies and tactics against large groups of opponents, all of whom had been trained soldiers of one breed or another. He'd also had to contend with the reinforcements issue, as well as unexpected interference from the armies on both sides of the fight, rolling through wherever he and the commandos were at the time. Steve had little doubt that given some time, Scott would learn how and when to employ the bigger field strategies and tactics. Steve himself fully intended to learn the smaller field stuff. They wouldn't be any use against Thanos and the Chitauri, but they would definitely be required if and when the Avengers tangled with some singular villain, or one with only a couple of... What had Tony called them again? Alright, minions. That chatting done, they headed into the mansion's sub-levels to train. Bruce had opted to sit out until the very end and transform long enough for Hulk to meet and interact with the X-Men, but not train with them. Given they hadn't done any combat training with Hulk and the Avengers yet, Steve figured that for a smart move. Though Steve had that planned, and for soon, they needed to get Hulk used to the idea of training, compared to all-out life-or-death fighting, as quick as possible. The hide-and-seek thing had worked like a treat, so Steve had high hopes for Hulk understanding what they were up to. That said, doing it with a strange team this early on just had bad idea written all over it. I think you're going to like our training facility, Scott told him. It's something Tony put together for us about 4 years ago. That's when the influx of kids really started happening, and we were in dire need of some place for them to learn how to control their abilities. Not to mention a place for us adults to learn to fight. I'm about 99.9% certain that Tony did in fact manage to invent a purely fictional piece of tech, though. What do you mean? Don't know if you know of it yet or how much, but there's a show called Star Trek? Scott asked. Heard of it? Tony and Bruce have mentioned it a few times. Haven't seen any of it yet because they warned me there was a definite order to things if I didn't want to get confused. Not to mention there evidently being a lot of it. Steve said, not to mention there having not been a whole heck of a lot of time to goof around since the team got together. Scott nodded. Right, so, one of the shows introduced this thing called a holodeck. Basically a big room where you could run 3D computer simulations and interact with what is being run. Steve gave an amused snort. Okay, yeah, I can see where Tony might try to actually invent that. Given he was so good with pretty much all things tech, not to mention such a thing would be invaluable for exactly what it was being used for. Both teams were already outside a big door by the time Steve and Scott got there. Jean, Logan, and John aside, there was a very encouraging level of ease and friendliness between the two groups already. That was going to make things a whole heck of a lot easier than if there'd been a bunch of personality clashes or just plain dislike between the two groups. Right. Because this is the first time we're working together under non-emergency conditions, we're going to be working a pretty simple scenario. Single, if damn big opponent, Scott told them. Interestingly, it looked to Steve like the X-Men knew instantly what they were going to be up against. It's a really big robot. Some flunky somewhere came up with it, intending for it to be an anti-mutant combatant. Fortunately for us, nobody but Tony seems to be able to build even the shell, never mind the program that'd be needed to allow the thing to move. Not to mention whatever programming it'd need to know a mutant from a non-mutant, because whoever dreamed this thing up was on some serious drugs. It'll do so much collateral damage, it's ridiculous. Scott told the Avengers. He motioned to the X-Men, tend to use them as a warm-up to something a little more dangerous. From Tony's expression, he also knew about these things. Steve absolutely wouldn't put it past him to be sabotaging the efforts of anyone trying to build the things. Which, good for him. Steve made a due mental note that he needed to address the so-called mutant problem the first chance he got. He'd made the mental note before, but it bore repeating. Tony might be willing to engineer said chance. Maybe. They all went inside the room and... Wow, if Steve didn't know better, he'd think they were actually in New York City. Queens, somewhere, by the look of things. Steve reached out and poked a nearby curb with the toe of his boot. It didn't feel any different than a real curb would. Before he could really do or say anything else, a god almighty racket started up at the end of the street and around the corner. A minute later, the damnedest thing Steve had ever seen came around the corner. The robot was 20 or 30 feet tall, first of all. Secondly, for whatever bizarre reason, it was painted blue and unbelievable! Third, the thing had what looks very much like Iron Man repulsors in the palms and the arc reactor in the chest. Steve had no idea if the robot predated Tony building the suit, but if it didn't, if someone had stolen Tony's designs, that was just going to make Tony foiling whatever idiots came up with the thing personal. That is really something. Steve managed after a moment. He completely agreed with Scott. Whoever came up with the thing that had been hitting the sauce way too hard. Thor, no, you can't work it with Mjolnir. Because he'd seen Thor start to swing his hammer with clear intent out of the corner of his eye. Thor stopped swinging the hammer, and Steve was pretty sure he actually pouted. One good hit with that hammer, and this thing be down for the count. Hulk could have it down about as fast. Given it was made entirely of metal, Magneto would probably laugh his ass off at the idea of this thing even potentially being a threat to him personally. Then he'd get severely pissed off at its mere existence. Not that Steve would blame him. Steve himself was starting to get hot under the collar. Because while the thing was very obviously no threat whatever to the X-Men, it'd terrify the holy hell out of a newly manifested kid, regardless of their mutation. And like with Rogue, not all mutations lend themselves to combat. A kid or even an adult like Rogue would be in serious trouble with this thing. You know who came up with this thing? It wasn't a question. Yeah, Scott said. From behind Steve came Iron Man's mechanized voice, quieter than usual and sing-songy. Somebody's in trouble. Steve gave an amused snort. Tony wasn't wrong. I want that name when we're done here. Thor, Iron Man, you two fly distraction. Loki, I know you could probably bring this thing down with one spell, but don't. That'd keep the Avengers heavy hitters from ending the fight before it even started. The point of this is to learn to work together, not see who could kick this thing's rear the fastest. That got more than one laugh from the entire group. That'd be a fun competition, though, Remy offered. Steve and Scott looked at each other, both amused. After a moment, they both nodded, and then Scott spoke up. Maybe when we're done with the teamwork stuff, if you guys still have the energy for it. For now, Storm, you're on distraction duty with Thor and Iron Man. Given Storm could, at the very least, call lightning like Thor could, she was evidently the X-Men's heavy hitter. Though Steve figured Scott's mutation could do serious damage, too. It was just that Scott could moderate his blasts, where maybe Storm couldn't. If her code name was any indication, her powers tended toward the bigger stuff. Lightning, hail, tornadoes maybe, that sort of thing. In a large area, and she either couldn't yet manage stuff on a smaller scale, or what she could manage on a small scale wasn't really combat applicable for this exercise. Rain, for instance.